Welcome to the Fredericksburg Nature Center in Fredericksburg, Texas. I'm Lonnie Childs. I'm the president of the Friends of the Fredericksburg Nature Center. The Fredericksburg Nature Center was formed in the year 2000 when Bill Lindeman, former president of the Native Plant Society and other organizations, saw a need for a nature center here in Fredericksburg. The local Convention and Visitors Bureau had approached them and say, where can we send visitors who want to go birding? Is there any public spaces? Bill realized very quickly that there weren't a lot of public spaces for people to do that. He also recognized the need for a local nature center for our local residents. So he began to look in the area, and he found a piece of land located here in the Lady Bird Johnson Municipal Park, kind of a forgotten segment of land over in the corner of the park, about 15 acres, cut off by a creek. The city decided that it was probably undevelopable for their needs of their master plan. But Bill, with his expertise, saw a completely different situation. He looked at this 15 acres, which was untouched by humankind for the last 35 years, and he saw great plant and faunal diversity, saw different little habitats, and realized that this would actually make a great nature center. So he approached the city and said, if I can put together a volunteer organization and raise the funding, will you allow us to develop a nature center? The city gladly said yes, with a bit of skepticism whether this thing would really work out and last over the years. But here, 21 years later, we have a nature park. We have a little over 1 mile of trails. We have a pollinator garden, a butterfly garden, a bird blind, a geology exhibit, and various other educational kiosks. And so Bill's vision has persisted to this day. The Nature Center, again, is located on 15 acres. We have a live all-season creek that flows through it, beautiful little creek. We have a diversity of habitats. This is typical hill country terrain. We're sitting up on top of the Edwards Plateau, which is an uplifted plateau of limestone deposited in the Cretaceous period about 65 to 100 million years ago. And this terrain is today largely, the topography is defined by erosion. So as drainages developed and worked their way up from the Gulf of Mexico, we are a land of mesa tops, canyons, with a few broad valleys and some of the big river drainages. So that defines the topography here. The Nature Center, and as sort of a confirmation of our diversity, we've surveyed and found about 265 species of plants, about 180 species of birds, either a resident here or pass through. We've got about 100 butterflies that we've found. We've got 50 plus odonates on the property. And that's all in the 15-acre period. 15-acre geography. So, welcome to the Fredericksburg Nature Center. We're going to take you around and we're going to show you the 7 microhabitats that exist here and talk about the terrain of each area and the species that you might find in that area, particularly the plant species. So let's move on down the trail. Here we are standing in our bird blind that we've created here at the Fredericksburg Nature Center. If you come 4 or 5 years ago, what you would have found here was basically the edge of a cedar brake, which is all cedar in here, just a thicket. So the first thing we did was we went in and we cleared out the cedar and we left some cedar. In terms of a bird habitat, we did have tall and mid canopy, mostly in the hackberry trees here. So we had high level canopy, but we had no understory. We had nothing on the ground. If you'd have filmed this, it was basically just a desert down here. And so this is an example where we've created a man-made microhabitat to provide ecological services for birds, but also for people, because we have a viewing stand. And so this is an example of what we talked about, a cultural ecological service. People enjoy watching birds. So if you look at the habitat we did put in, again, we started with understory. So we put in shrubs, small trees. We have Texas persimmon. We have a pokeweed over here. On this side opposite me over here, we have a large, it's the West Texas mulberry, native mulberry. We've put in things like American beautyberry for berries. We've got Carolina buckthorn, rusty black alder vern. Again, a lot of plants are going to produce berries, which are ideal food source for birds. On the ground, then we put in forbs, seed-producing forbs. We put in some grasses like what is now called dryland wood oak. And so, again, our mission here was to create a microhabitat, sort of artificially composed of plants that are going to attract and provide services to our bird population. And so we find some of our local resident species come in, but we also get a lot of, in the spring and fall migrations come and get a lot of birds who stop off here for a bite to eat, a little water. We added a water feature. A big major component if you want to attract birds. Food sources are great. We add water and you get a lot more species even when you come to the food sources. So this is our bird habitat. Again, an example of a man-made microhabitat designed to meet a specific ecological service need. Okay, before we go on and talk about the microhabitats we're going to see, let me just stop and talk about what is a microhabitat or a habitat. So a habitat is thought of in two ways. One, at the species level, it's the topography, the physical environment, and the food sources and the water and the things that support a single species. But in a broader sense, it's the assemblage of plants and animals and the physical environment. And so that describes a habitat. And then when we talk about microhabitats, those are just small, geographically or space-wise. It's a small example of a large habitat. So we have 7 microhabitats in Fredericksburg Nature Center, and we're going to go through each one of those. But again, they're small spaces, but they exhibit the qualities of specific habitats. The other concept I'll introduce you to is ecological services. So what are ecological services? They're again defined in two ways. One, they're defined as in terms of humans, which is the gains acquired by humankind from surrounding ecosystems. So I like to think of them in a more general way is if you look at a habitat, it provides services, it contributes to our overall environment, whether it's providing water, a number of different kinds of services. And so ecological services are broken into 4 categories. There's provisional services, that's providing materials. That's providing water, food, fuel, wood for humans, and so forth. Then there are regulating services. And those provide basic services that make life possible for people. Plants, they take in carbon dioxide, they put out oxygen, so they provide clean water. There's wetland plants that filter water, bacteria that decompose materials. There's soil building services. So all those regulating services, again, are big contributions to our overall environment and their well-being. And then there's supporting services, and those are foundational. Plants perform photosynthesis. They're the only organism we have that can take sunlight and convert it into starches that provide the basics for our food chain. Other things that fall under the category of supporting services include soil building is another prime example. And finally, there are cultural services. So those are non-material contributions made by environments to human culture. So if you think, again, a good example, we're going to see the bird blind later people enjoy watching birds. And if it wasn't for our natural environment, well, obviously wouldn't be performing birds. So the first microhabitat we're going to talk about now is what's known as a cedar brake. And when we talk about cedar in Central Texas, really that's ash juniper. Ash juniper cedar has always been here. There was some debate about that, but in sort of pre-European times, ash juniper existed up on mesa tops, in rocky creek canyons, on slopes, growing in thin rocky soils. And what kept it in check was wildfires. So as that ash juniper tried to creep out of that canyon and up on the prairies, it might have get a little bit of a foothold, but every 5, 6, 10 years, whatever, a wildfire would come through and wipe that cedar out because the ash juniper is not fire tolerant. When European man came in, then of course we eradicated wildfires, or we fought them, we contained them. And so that normal cycle was broken. Whenever you break the biological control on a specific species, then they're just trying to survive and thrive, and so they spread. And so that's what's happened with ash juniper in the hill country, and thus the creation of so-called cedar breaks. And they're cedar breaks because as people would come through the country, and immigrants, when you would hit these cedar breaks, and they're basically, when they're in a mature state, they are impenetrable. Nothing grows in a full, thick cedar break because of two things. Obviously, there's no sunlight. The other thing is cedars are water hogs in the sense, not that they drink a lot more, but that thick thatch. I think the study I read said about when rainfall falls on a cedar tree, about 60% of that rainfall is captured in the thatch of the cedar tree. It never hits the ground. And that's why here we found out in the big freeze in February, lots of cedar trees went down because they caught so much rainfall that froze on them. The weight of all that ice destroyed a lot of them. So if you look again, a mature cedar break is impenetrable. We're standing here in the edge of a cedar break, just the edges of it. Of course, we've cleared out some of it, and you do get some plants that grow under cedar if there's a little bit of openness and it's not thick. One of the examples is our two yuccas that grow in the hill country. The Buckley's yucca is growing here. We have a twist leaf yucca growing down here. We do have some grasses that can creep in on the edges where there's open sunlight. There's little blue stem. We do have some forbs that'll grow in here. Our Salvia coccinea will grow in here. We've had brown plum growing in here. And those are the major things. We do get, again, we get some ground forbs, some zexminia, and kind of open spots where a little bit of sunlight is allowed in. So cedar breaks have been considered the bane of Central Texas ecology. We spend a lot of time and energy clearing ash juniper, and it does need to be controlled, but there's nothing wrong with pockets of thick cedar, again, in their appropriate environment, and in rocky creek, rocky canyons and steep hillsides. They're on this hillside, they're holding the hillside up, they're retaining the soil. So they do provide some ecological services. They're probably low on the ecological service scale. The birds do love the fruits that come off of them, but you don't want a whole environment consumed by ash juniper. And so hence our battle against ash juniper continues. All right, here we are in our next microhabitat. This is a very arid habitat, as you can see. I call it the South Texas Plain meets the Edwards Plateau, because it's rocky, thin, the soils are not thick, but yet some of the vegetation you'll see kind of comes from that South Texas plain. This is, you're standing on what's called Hensel sandstone. So this dates back 70, 80, 100 million years ago it was formed. Again, when the Texas Hill Country was covered by shallow sea, and it deposited limestones and sandstones. As that sea then receded and fell away, you were left with these limestone sandstone formations, which again in the last 100 years, 100 million years, have been sculpted by erosion, drainages, and so this actually was, if you look about 20 feet that way, is the current stream bed. Right here is the ancient stream bed from tens of millions of years ago. Water flowed through and sculpted this sandstone, so you get all of these kind of very dramatic formations. So in terms of soil and vegetation and wildlife, up on the hillside here, you've got some thicker soils, and the soils are sandy with a lot of clay in them, so a sandy clay kind of soil, and so that limits the kinds of plants that normally live here. And then as you come down the slope and get into more rock, you only have thin pockets of, again, this very sandy clay. To think about availability of water here and rainfall, not great. We've got a steep hillside. Water is going to come down that very quickly. Some may percolate into the soil here, but when it hits this rock, it's just going to go right off the rock shelf and into the creek. So plants here have to be opportunistic to find these pockets of soil that they can exist in. And again, they're plants that can suffer arid conditions. So let's examine some of those plants. Right here in front of me, we have Nolina texana, commonly referred to bear grass. I think it's a wonderful plant in your landscape. And obviously one of the big services it provides here to this environment, to this habitat, it's a good soil retention plant. It can find that pocket of soil and cascade off the sides. So it's a great plant. We also have, of course, Opuntia, our prickly pear, Opuntia that seems to grow everywhere, but it does well in these thin soils. If you then look up the hillside, we've got our twist-leaf yucca, likes to grow on this hillside. We've also got Buckley's yucca growing in here. You won't be able to pick it out today, but there's quite a few Mimosa borealis in here, a nondescript plant that you don't notice until in the spring it bursts out with its pink puffball flowers. We also have a little bit of mesquite. So there's the South Texas Plains part. There is mesquite that comes up here in the thicker soils just above this rock shelf. And then if you go down and you look at forbs and grasses, there are grasses in here. There's Cytodes, grama growing over there, I see. The forbs are plants, again, that can grow in thin soils. Zexminia is one of the bigger ones up there. We've got small forbs like gray golden aster, lazy daisy, skeleton plant. And then one of our special forbs, wildflowers that grows here is quite interesting. We have a bluebonnet, Lupinus subcarnosus, the sandyland bluebonnet. So it was actually the original state flower in, I believe, 1901. And then in the 70s, but it's not the predominant bluebonnet in Texas. It grows east of here in the sandy lands, kind of east of I-35. So in 1901, it became the state flower. In early 1970s, the legislature went back and said, we're going to recognize Lupinus subcarnosa, Lupinus texensis, our most common bluebonnet, and any of the other lupinuses. So they're all the state flower. But so the interesting thing is we've got this sandyland bluebonnet growing here. Probably the nearest populations, again, are at least 100 miles east of here, southeast of San Antonio. How did it show up here? Well, we don't know. There's no evidence that it was introduced in any way, but it grows in these little pockets of sandy soil up here, and so we've got a quite unique species, way disjointed from its normal geographic area. But we're proud to have population of Lupinus subcarnosa here in the Fredericksburg Nature Center. Okay, our next microhabitat we're going to talk about is the riparian zone. Riparian zones are areas along creeks and waterways. And we're standing here in the bridge over Live Oak Creek, which again is our all-weather creek that flows year-round. It emanates from northwest Gillespie County up to the head of some drainages where there are a number of seeps and springs that feed this creek, and therefore it's, again, a constant level creek. You have to listen real close today because the wind's high, but you'll hear the rippling of water. And so remember I talked about ecological services and specifically cultural ecological services. So these are non-material services that contribute to the development of human culture. And in this case, what human wouldn't like to hear the sound of rippling spring or a creek? Soothes the soul, calms the nerves. We'd all like to have this sound piped into our bedrooms. And in fact, today, I guess with Google and Apple, you can get that sound. There's an app for it. So I'm always an advocate that Google and Apple ought to have to pay a royalty to Mother Nature for appropriating the sounds of riparian music. So if you look at this riparian area, some people would look at it and say, well, it's neat, but it's messy. It ought to be cleaned up. I seem to develop this human habit of we always want to clean up riparian areas, park them up, clean out the brush, raise the trees, and that is the absolute wrong thing to do. A healthy riparian area is a messy riparian area to the human eye. And why? Well, you've got water. You want to retain that water. You want to keep that water. How do you get more water? You build up the soil bank on either side, because the soil bank is like a sponge. As you make that soil bank healthier, it brings up the water table, which will bring up the water table of the creek, and you retain more water in this area. And how do you do that? Well, you need some of the big anchor plants. If you look down the creek here, you can see there's a big sycamore, there's a giant bald cypress over there. We've got some willow in here. And so what those do, bald cypress is the absolute number 10 on the soil bank building scale. All those roots hold the soil. Now, as you have minor floods, of course, you're going to have debris floating down and hanging up on those roots. We humans, again, want to go clean that debris up, but no, you want to leave that debris there, because what that debris will do is it will catch soil into little pockets. Once it catches a little soil, then it allows other shrubs and forbs and little trees to take hold of that soil. Now you're starting to build the vegetative cover for that soil bank. The next thing you're going to have is the smaller trees and some of the understory shrubs. So along here we've got a lot of buttonbush, we've got a lot of elderberry, we've got some indigo bush, false indigo, and a number of small trees and shrubs like that. Again, that Baccharis is one of those plants that's not well thought of, but it's a great soil builder along riparian area. And then after you get that, then you move down and we've got a lot of good grasses. We've got switchgrass growing along the creek here. We've got giant sedge. We've got stands of eastern gamagrass. And so those are great retainers of the soil. And then we've got some nice little forbs that do grow along here that are pleasing to the human eye. We've got cardinal flower. We've got big stands of tall aster growing in here. And so that's how you build a healthy riparian area. You got to leave it and let the cycle take place. Let that vegetation come in, let it catch the debris, let the soil bank build up, and the water levels will come up and you'll have a healthier creek. The other thing I should talk about here is we have periodic flooding. In the 21 years that we've been here, we've had a number of small floods, but we had 2 major floods that came in here and just really scoured the landscape. And you have to be prepared to accept that. But again, if you let the big trees come in, the shrubs and some of that, you will reduce the impact of that flooding and you will have less erosion. If you look across the creek here, there's an area over here that in 2018 we had a flood, and that was some trees left, but it was completely almost open. It were almost all the vegetation was gone. We had a major flood that took this in the bend of the creek, went over there. We couldn't afford to wait for 20 or 30 years for all that piled up vegetation to go away, so we cleaned it out. But here, 3 years later, literally, it's a thicket. 3 years ago, it was completely open. Nothing standing but some of the larger trees. So you have to accommodate yourself to periodic flooding cycles, and again, the way you mitigate that somewhat is you keep healthy vegetation in this riparian zone. So going back to the concept of ecological services, what's the value of this? Again, we measure the value of the habitats by the value of their ecological services. Lots of ecological services here, from food to water to cultural services. So one of the most prized of our macro habitats. Okay. So we're looking across Live Oak Creek right now, and we're looking at what we call the Fern Grotto. This is at the bottom of the arid habitat we talked about earlier. If you looked up at the top there, there's a whole bed of sandstone. And what's kind of interesting to me is up on top is an arid habitat. The water just cascades off of there, and you have very dryland plants. And you come around down the cliff face, and 10 feet from that, you're into a lush riparian habitat, a microhabitat. Specifically, then you've got this little fern grotto growing in there. And so just very slight conditions within a very few number of feet, you can go from one habitat to another. This fern grotto lives off, this is our maidenhair fern, Adiantum capillus veneris. And so what it's living off of is a water seep. So water falls up on top of that hill. Some of it will percolate into that soil and go down into the pencil sandstone formation. It's a very dense formation, so I don't know how many years it takes to percolate through that, but probably quite a few. But then it comes down here at the bottom, and it comes out of what we call seeps here in the hill country. So in 21 years that we've been here, that seep has never gone dry. There are dry periods where areas of the maidenhair fern may brown out and die back, but it's growing in a little bit of soil with a lot of organic matter, survives through the winter, and every spring it comes back out, and we have this beautiful fern grotto. Nearby, there's big stands of switchgrass, and there's a bald cypress nearby. So it's kind of a little riparian oasis. Something I think every landowner would love to have on their property. So. All right, here we are in our next habitat. We're in a mature live oak forest, which is kind of interesting. So if you think about live oaks grow on some of our thinner calcareous soils in the hill country. So here we are up above the creek. We've come up out of the flood bank. We've got an area with a little deeper soil. Live oaks in the hill country, typically, this is what you would see. Big oaks kind of spread out. In today's world, we have live oak mott's. If you look at those trees, they're maybe 6 or 8 inches in diameter. They're 100-year-old trees. And they, like the juniper, took advantage of the fact that European settlers, early settlers, stopped the wildfire cycle. So that allowed live oaks to spread also into the prairie areas and form these mott's of smaller trees, kind of opportunistic. Of course, in today's environment, we're suffering from oak wilt, which is taking a big toll on the live oaks. But again, maybe that's Mother Nature's way of thinning things out. We took away the biological control of the oak trees because they are not particularly fire tolerant. They spread, and that created the opportunity for again, the oak wilt to take advantage of that. And so now we have big areas in the hill country where we have massive areas of dead oak, live oaks from the oak wilt. So if you look at this microhabitat here, we have a few large live oaks, hundreds of years old. Because of the shade and stuff, very little is growing in here. We do have all these little understory trees are sugar hackberries that have come in here because the birds have eaten the seeds and made deposits. But other than that, very little ground cover things growing on the forest floor. We do have our twist leaf yucca will grow in here in this mottled sunlight. We've got some buckwheat yucca, things like smilax, greenbrier likes to grow in here. I guess part of it can kind of grow to the sunlight. We've got some Virginia creeper, but not a lot of other things grow on the forest floor. The other thing you'll notice then, there are no successors to these big live oak trees. Why? Because we have a big deer population, right? So if they don't eat the acorns, they eat the saplings. And so that's one of our dilemmas here in the hill country is a lot of these kinds of trees, we don't have a successor generation because the deer take such a toll on their small progeny. So this is our live oak forest microhabitat. It is nice and shady, so but in terms of ecological services provided, probably on the lower side, because there's not much vegetative diversity here. All right, here we are in one of our most diverse habitats of the prairie. Look out, and the topography here is we have deep sandy soils, wide open, so all the sunshine you could want. So this is habitat heaven for our wildflowers. Primarily, we've got a lot of grasses growing in here. This is a mid-grass prairie, so we've got most of the taller grasses we're seeing are little blue stem. Those are the big four that grow in our prairies. Those are the ones that probably survived the longest. At one point, probably hundreds of years ago, might have been a little wider open, might have had some of our taller grass prairies, but again, we've got lots of little blue stem, lots of cytosgrama, hairy grama, some of those mid grasses. We don't see many shrubs. We do buckwheat yucca is growing out here, so we have some stands of that. There's one live oak that ventured out and is trying to take hold here in the prairie and move the woodlands into the prairie area. But in terms of wildflowers, of course, this is, again, wildflower heaven. So we've got skeleton plant, golden dahlia, uni blue sage, Engelmann's daisy, prairie verbena, and the two vervains. And we have spring range or fall range. The rain lilies pop up everywhere. So this is, again, where we have our best collection of wildflowers. We love this area a whole bunch. So we'll move down the trail here, and I want to show you, talk about the margin between the woodlands and the prairie. Just down the trail here a bit. So here we are at the margins of our prairie where it meets the woodlands. And there's a story to be told here that kind of reflects the ecological history of the hill country here in the last 2 years. When you come here 200 years ago, what you were seeing was a prairie area and a post oak savanna back behind this map. The hill country has typically been described as a mosaic of open grasslands and shrubby woodlands. It was that way 200 years ago, it is that way today. The composition and the percentages of that is kind of what's changed. We don't have the tall grasslands we have. We still have grasslands, but they're mid-grass or short grass prairies. To some extent, some of the shrubby woodlands have advanced with live oak mott's or ash juniper. The other thing that's happened though to the woodlands as they've become shrubbier. And that's the example here. Behind all of this, there is, in fact, a post oak savanna. What's come in here is we've got ash juniper that have formed a little cedar break at the margin, penetrated things like our Spanish grapes and Mustang grapes. Smilax thickets have come in and infiltrated the post oak savanna and filled it up. So it's not open as it traditionally would. A post oak savanna would be like the post oaks, blackjack oaks, and then underneath that you would have some shrubs, agarita, persimmon, some forbs like salvia, gloxinia, things like that. But in this case, it's become kind of intentional. So maybe someday in the future we'll like to take this on and restore this habitat and clean some of the shrubby stuff out and open it up so the post oak savanna is a real deal again. But again, what I'm pointing out is this margin between grasslands and shrubby woodlands is kind of the story of the hill country, with them battling to see who's going to win. If we had the fires that we had a couple of 100 years ago, the prairies would be winning more. But since they've taken that away, the shrubby woodlands are taking advantage of that opportunity. So we've talked about our prairies, and then I've also talked about the post oak savanna. So that's our next microhabitat to discuss. But we sort of plunged into that. But again, this margin is sort of the statement of the ecological history of the hill country for the last 200 years. So here's one more shot of the post oak savanna I was talking about. And if you look in here, you see these large post oaks around. But then you've got a lot of small trees and shrubbery. You've got flame leaf sumac. There's a big giant one poking way up through a couple of them. We've got other understory shrubbery that's come in. In the days when we had wildfires still burned here periodically, that wildfire would have come off the prairie and would have come underneath here and kept a lot of this shrubby growth down. As post oaks and blackjack oaks, which are primarily the big trees on the post oak savanna, they've evolved to have very thick bark, so they can withstand wildfires, unlike live oaks do. And so this would have been a lot more open. You would have had some shrubs and small trees, but it would have been a lot more open with grasses and forbs even coming in underneath the post oak savanna. They do grow, and this is the thickest soil you have in the park. Like the prairie, you got very deep sandy soil, so it's very amenable to those two species of oak. But this is again a picture of the story of the hill country, where the cessation of wildfires, and which are a biological control, once they're removed, species take different paths and take their opportunities, and so the habitats change.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
All right, well, welcome to our last habitat we're going to talk about, and that's a wetland habitat. We have just a small area here, it's really microhabitat, but going along the creek, obviously, we have gravel and sandbanks underneath the water that create very shallow patches of water. And so the things we have growing along here are giant studs. We have grasses like switchgrass. We have eastern dam grass. We have spike rushes growing in here. We have a little area over there you can kind of see this American water willow. So these are the plants that grow with their feet in the water. One of the main ecological services wetlands provide is they filter the water. Things that come through, they pull it out of the water, and so that's a major significant importance of wetlands that people overlook oftentimes. They think, well, this wet area we ought to just fill in. But wetlands are important to our environment, and so if you have wetlands, protect those wetlands. So, well, that concludes our tour of the Fredericksburg Nature Center. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something from it. If I have one point I hope to make with you or leave you with, it's that if you noticed in our 15 acres, 7 different microhabitats. So my message there is diversity, diversity, diversity. Whether it's your backyard, a piece of land, whatever you have, promote diversity. That's the challenge in our modern world. We're losing our diversity. So the little part you can do is promote diversity in our homeland state. So thank you again. From Fredericksburg Nature Center, it's been Lonnie Childs. And please come out and visit us in Fredericksburg. Thank you.
This is a Gilbride Productions video by me, Paula Stone.